You're listening or watching Pop Culture Clash on the Strangers in Space network, and I'm going to be asking Andrew Cartmel a few searching questions so that you don't have to.
Very few searching questions. Lots of easy questions, I hope.
They should be easy, but let's hope they inspire the conversation. Andrew, thank you very much for doing this.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I think officially you're number two in the experiment of trying this new format, so we're hoping it inspires good conversation. How are you anyway?
I'm great. I'm great.
You
Busy.
are.
And if you're a freelancer, it's always great to be busy. And as a writer, I like to have a couple projects, very different projects on the go at the same time, which is exactly what I'm doing now because I'm writing a novel and I've got a play about to open. So for my particular kind of that's my idea of paradise, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, it's opening very soon, isn't it? Your play.
Yeah, first week of May is on the 3rd to the 8th of May. It's not even a whole week in the little suburb of Barnes, of London called Barnes.
Mm. It's just off the underground, isn't it? As far as I can tell.
Just off the overground. Either Barnes or Barnes Bridge are very close and quite a pleasant walk. And it's a lovely place. It's got a duck pond. I don't know, maybe all your listeners live in villages with duck ponds, but here in London, that's kind of a novelty.
I think we've got a fair few listeners and viewers these days with YouTube around the London area. So you hear it, you heard it first here,
Oh, and Sophie
guys.
Aldred's coming to my play. Sophie's coming. She's booked a ticket for her and her husband. So yeah, we got Doctor Who royalty coming to the play. And so if your listeners were to come along, who knows? On one of those 7 performances, Sophie's going to be there. So it's kind of like Sophie Roulette.
As if you needed any other reason, though, Andrew. You're Doctor Who royalty, so why would they need any other reason to come?
Well, I would say, why would they need any other reason than to see a really gripping thriller, brilliantly acted? Because we've got some great actors and very effectively directed by Conrad Blakemore. So, I mean, if you like theatre, and I love live theatre, and you always want to just be totally taken out of yourself and drawn into a play, this will do that.
It's interesting, as a few months back, every now and again we do film reviews, not just recent films, but sometimes sort of fairly historic
Classics
films.
of
Yes,
yesteryear.
and I noticed in the blurb for your play, the name Death Trap was used, and that was one of the
Ooh,
films we actually covered.
oh, well,
And
that's kind of too interesting in several ways because I love the guy who wrote the Ira Levin. He also wrote Rosemary's Baby, right? He's a genius and a hero of mine. In fact, his son is sort of like an internet friend, and Nick Levin, and I invited him to London to come and see my play. And the guy who's directing my play, Conrad, his dad, Michael Blakemore, directed Death Trap in the West End. So this is just great connection there. So Ira Levin is a big overlap, but the movie of Death Trap is directed by this guy called Sidney Lumet. And I've just gone down a Sidney Lumet rabbit hole. I don't know if you can see this. I've bought his book, his sort of memoir about making movies. I've bought loads of his DVDs and Blu-rays because I discovered there's dozens of really interesting films that I'd never seen by him, and he's a great director. So, and Death Trap is amongst the pile to be watched, although I saw it years ago, and
mm,
it's. I recently reread the play, and it's a dynamite suspense play, very funny too. So it's the sort of thing that I aspire to. I put the play on. The theatre said, "Well, what would you compare it to, so we can tell people in the public?" And I thought, well, Death Trap, and also Dial M for Murder, which is this great. Actually, that's a Frederick Knott thriller, but I suggested a different one, Wait Until Dark, which is slightly more. But he also wrote Dial M for Murder. But that same, he's a master of suspense as well, Knott, and he found these great ways of packing in these kind of furiously tense stories into a stage set, which is the that's the art of writing a stage thriller.
it's interesting. You saying about waiting till dark. I read the synopsis, and it's one of those films that I feel like I've seen, but
It's
I couldn't
surprising they
tell.
haven't remade it. But I think it was only made once in the 60s with Audrey Hepburn,
Mm.
something like that.
I think the fact that she plays a blind woman, doesn't she, in it?
Yeah, and it's a brilliantly conceived thriller. It's about this blind woman who's in this apartment and these crooks. She's got something that the crooks are after, or she doesn't even know it's there. So it's a milestone of suspense writing.
But equally, your play is going to be just as suspenseful and everybody should.
It's in its own modest way, because it's just three characters, very simple set. Yes, it is.
Okay, Andrew, let's use that as the lead in. I've been given a number of questions by JR. I've got my orders, so I'm going to work my way through them in a random fashion. I'll try and slot them into conversation to give us like a nice thread that runs through the conversation. So
Great.
let's start. What should we start with? Seeing as you've been talking about the art of writing, if you had to choose between the two, would you choose reading or writing?
Well, ooh. Writing, because you are kind of reading as well, because you're constantly rereading your own stuff. So that the Venn diagram of that sort of contains both sets, so to speak. But I would hate. There was a writer I deeply admired called Peter O'Donnell. He created a character called Modesty Blaise, and he wrote some cracking thrillers about her. And there was a lot to learn from him. There's nothing he didn't know about storytelling technique. And I remember we used to write letters back and forth. This is in the days of letters. And one of his letters said, "Oh, I've just been very busy reading." He says, and he felt that you couldn't just write. You had to sort of replenish your well by reading, which I thought, oh, that's really interesting. He hadn't reached a point where he thought he knew it all. He constantly needed fresh input. I thought, oh, that's very, very interesting. And also, I love reading. I'm on a bit of a vintage crime novel kick at the moment, and I'm having such fun doing that.
Is that how is it kind of fed back into your play work?
Into my plays and into my novels,
Okay,
absolutely.
certainly. Right. Okay. Here's another question. Then so you've done challenge number one. Challenge number two: The Vinyl Detective or Rivers of London.
Final Detective, because it's my baby. Rivers is Ben's baby, and I've worked with him co-writing the comics, which is a great little line of comics based on a very quirky and magnificent series of novels. But the novels are Ben's, and my Vinyl Detective novels are mine. So that's an easy one.
I mean, how this is probably a very difficult question to sum up in a few words, but writing for comics and writing obviously a different. But put it another way, how do the three disciplines, theatre, prose, and comics, is there a crossover?
There's a crossover between all those, and I've also written audio, and I've written screenplays of various kinds, TV and films. Some of the TV stuff I actually got on, and they all have their own unique kind of appeal, and also their unique strengths, and also their difficulties. Like if you're writing a stage play, it's all got to happen there on the stage, right? And ideally, if you want to observe what they call the unities, it should take place in the same location. Like you should never sort of go anywhere else, but just the one set. And it should be in continuous time. Like everything should happen just like right in front of you without even any time lapses. And that's doable, but that's really demanding. So that's an interesting constraint on that. Novels are wonderful because you can get inside the head of the character and also the head of the reader. Your words go directly into the mind of the reader, unmediated by anybody else, in exactly the form that you choose. So there's nothing like that in terms of nothing better than that in terms of communicating your ideas. But it takes a long time to write a book compared to a play or a comic or any of the other things we talked about. It takes a lot. There's 90,000 words, and there's a lot of words. It's a lot of bricks to stack up to build that wall.
Do you have do you find it hard to consolidate? You know, you say about 90,000 words. I mean, does that give you a bigger sandbox, or is that a different constraint in some respects?
It's a different sandbox. You could write within that 90,000 words. You could write a sprawling novel with many characters, lots of strands, and set it all over the world. But you could also write a novel about a guy in a room, basically. So it doesn't necessarily imply a greater scope or scale, but it's a very different kind of discipline to write about. The world's your oyster in a novel, but it takes a long time to write. Like I say, there's all those words, and also because it's a long form, you can screw it up. Like I mean, you could write too much. You could be boring. You could write too much the same kind of thing. So if you're doing a short story or a poem or a limerick or a play or anything that's small, that's shorter, it's easier to discern the structure and see where things go wrong. When you're in the middle of a novel, when you're 30 or 40,000 words into a novel, you might have lost your way the way you might lose your way in a forest.
I've heard it said before that short stories are harder than novels, but I don't
They're more
think that is the
concentrated.
case.
In the novel, you've got lots of chances to make your point. So, and in a short story, you've got to be very succinct, but they are a lot shorter.
Yes, there is that. There is that. Okay. We've always obviously mentioned your vinyl detective novels. Um, here's a question for you: jazz or blues?
Jazz. But jazz incorporates a lot of blues influences. It'll surprise no one to hear, but I was listening to some blues and some rock the other day, and it's great up to a point, but you don't want to listen to a 5 minute rock song or blues number necessarily, because unless you listen to a really virtuoso player whose feel is coming through, there's not going to be enough variation in the music really to hold one's attention, I think. Whereas jazz playing, there's going to be enough complexity and enough kind of meat in there for your mind to chew on for a long form tune to hold the attention. I'm not talking about a 90-minute, 90-second pop ditty, but I do think that pop and rock and the blues start to get in trouble as soon as they get a bit more than a couple of minutes long.
Hmm. I mean, if I was to turn my camera around, the other wall of my uh, studio office thing is covered in CDs, but I'm a far more straight down the line rock and pop man, and maybe electronic music and things like that. But
Yeah.
jazz is something that has always evaded me, but I've always felt a desire to understand it. Is it a case of understanding, or would you?
No, it's a case of reacting to it. Just buy Miles Davis' kind of Blue if you haven't already, and just listen to that. It's one of the greatest records of all time. If you never buy another jazz record, you'll still have a fantastic jazz record. And if you want a short list of a few others, I mean, just another one. Everybody's heard of Kind of Blue, but nobody's heard of After the Rain by Michel Legrand. I think that's an incredible LP or CD. So just grab that as well. There's a number of others I'd be happy to recommend. But the thing is, people have a very kind of they have a very different idea of what jazz is and whether or not they're going to like it. I was doing a radio show and we had to think of a name for it. We called it the Jazz Lounge, but I realized rapidly that I had two problems. One is if I ever played anything that wasn't jazz, the jazz purists would be unhappy. Like, it's the Jazz Lounge. He's playing rock, blues, funk, so insert term here. And on the other hand, people who didn't like jazz would never even listen. So I've with the support of Shay Coffey at Medway Pride Radio, who were the first people to do my show. It's now gone out in a couple of stations, I'm delighted to say. With her support, I'm changing the show, changing the format, and we're launching it again today, as it happens,
Oh.
as Vinyl Detective Radio. So the great thing about that is, number one, it promotes my books, and I'm all about the money. But number two, it gives me greater creative freedom, so I can play a load of film music or some blues or some pop or some Italian vocalists, and I don't have this background feeling of guilt that I'm not playing enough jazz. And I will play plenty of jazz too, but it has freed me up wonderfully.
Well, what I hope is that if I can find that jumping on point, I'm sure that a lot of the music that I've listened to in the past has some kind of jazz influence in there.
There's nothing wrong with rock and pop and blues and electronic music. I mean, The Doors, LA Woman, one of the greatest albums of all time. And that I was banging on about how, rock isn't complicated enough to hold my attention. Every single note of that album is a masterpiece and never ceases to compel my attention. Also, Aqualung by Jethro Tull. That's wonderfully complex and gritty, and it's beautifully produced. It's got a kind of Sergeant Pepper thing going on in the sense that the music is happening, but they also do a lot of studio trickery. But Aqualung by Jethro Tull, amazing, amazing record that never disappoints. Yeah. So, or James Taylor's Sweet Baby James, that's sort of country rock, but it's a
Mm.
lovely record. And again, every note of it just resonates with me.
I mean, there's a question on JL's list. Oh, actually, no, that's a good one. Bob Dylan or the Smiths?
Bob Dylan, I don't know enough about the Smiths to condemn them, but I just don't feel that Morrissey has the depth of Bob Dylan. I'm not saying that Bob Dylan is the greatest recording artist of all time, although he's a contender. But I certainly, to my mind, he's of a much greater stature than Morrissey. People tell me that Johnny Marr is an amazing guitarist, and I don't think Bob Dylan has any claim to be a great instrumentalist or singer, but as a songwriter, I think he's one of the most important of our time.
I can vouch for Johnny Marr. Certainly, he's one of my guitar gods.
I saw him in concert with, wait for it, Hans Zimmer
Yes, yes,
in
totally.
London a few years
I,
ago.
he has a
Yeah.
perpetual curiosity about music, which I just think is worth gold alone. It's okay. Where are we going? Let's move away from music. Okay, Marilyn Monroe or Marlon Brando.
Oh, Marilyn Monroe, boy, Marilyn, not taking away anything from Brando, who is an amazing presence and a great actor, right? And if you'd asked me just instead of just but choose one or the other, if you'd said which one is the better actor, like 10 years ago, I said, oh, Marilyn can't really act. She's just like a personality. And Brando's a great actor. Well, Brando is a great actor, but since then I've learned that what I thought was just Marilyn Monroe walking around being Marilyn Monroe, that was a carefully constructed performance by a deeply talented actress who could do all kinds of things. But it's funny, I've seen them both recently in movies, both movies I'd recommend. Brando is in a great little kind of surrealistic thriller, existential thriller called Night of the Following Day. Isn't that a great title? And he's at his peak as a kind of charismatic thug in that brandishing a machine gun. And he's amazing and he's great. But I'll have to take Marilyn Monroe in Niagara. There's a scene in Niagara where Marilyn is just in a motel bed smoking a cigarette. She's got nothing on, but it's 1954. So she's got the sheet tucked up to her chin. But my God, it blows any pornography out of the water in terms of sexual intensity. Just Marilyn smoking a fag and in this motel room and knowing she's got nothing on under her clothes. It's one of the most scalding and fantastically rewarding sexual images of modern cinema, I would say.
Okay, I mean the thing about her is that we know a lot more now about her than we did then. I'm assuming, but there's always this feeling that there's so much more going on behind those amazing eyes.
Well,
I
when you
find her a
see her do a number of
fascinating
different
person.
things, like I saw the turning point was a movie called Bus Stop, in which she's sort of playing the Marilyn Monroe type, but you can tell that's not who she is. She's just doing a great performance as this kind of ditzy showgirl. And that's a really great movie. Um, and then I learn about the tragedy of her life. And also, I'm a massive admirer of Arthur Miller, who, of course, who was married to her and sort of had the terrible pain of being kind of bonded with her as she was heading downwards, and there's nothing he could do about that. I think the thing about Marilyn was it was booze and drugs. I mean, she was a troubled woman, but if you take the booze and drugs out of the equation, I think she could still be with us today. I really do think it's terrible, the the toxic effect of the things we use to self-medicate in our society.
Yeah, yeah. This may seem like an obvious question, in as much as we should already know the answer, but I was going to ask you about vinyl or CD, but maybe physical media or MP3.
Well, the two questions are intimately related because vinyl, obviously, all the time. Like I was, I was listening to some music today on CD, and I thought this is so great. But I thought, oh, imagine if I was listening on vinyl to something similar. So I got the vinyl out and I put it on, and sure enough, it was that much better. I mean, it was vastly better. But I mentioned that I'm a DJ. I do a radio show. I cannot tell you how wonderful CDs are. I put them into this little drive and I connect it to my laptop. My laptop identifies what the track is and it codes it so that when I play it on my show somewhere, the people who, the artists, get paid for their music. And that all happens digitally. It's all because this digital information has been linked to the digital copy of the music. And that's wonderful. I just think it's superb. But yeah, always physical media. Like I buy Blu-rays and DVDs uh, rather than just download stuff. I I think it's superior.
Mm-hmm. So therefore, obviously we would place radio over streaming services then. I mean, how do you feel?
Yeah,
Do
and
you
as soon
think?
as you say streaming services, I start to get this fire of anger in my stomach because I know how ripped off musicians are. Like you can have a million plays on Spotify and you get a penny. That's
Mm.
just, it is completely wrong. And I just hope that it gets sorted out because artists are getting shafted. Anyway, so when you say streaming services, it takes about 10 minutes for me to calm down. So forgive me.
I mean, I'm that. My psychology is that if I use a streaming service, I treat it like a radio service. In as much as if I find something I like, then I'll go straight over to Bandcamp and
Oh,
buy the
that's
CD.
really good. And like Bandcamp is wonderful. And I think every month, I think it's the first Friday, they have a sale. So you can get
Yes.
whatever you want and get it cheaper. But Bandcamp is wonderful. And please, people, don't steal music. Buy, even if you steal a lot of music, occasionally buy some. I had a friend who was always stealing movies online. And he always said, I'm broke, but if I ever have money, I'll just pay for everything. And sure enough, as soon as he got money, he just started buying stuff legit. So I understand if people, especially if they're students or something. But, you know, the people who made those movies, if you're watching an illicit copy, they're not getting paid for their work. So anything you could do to reward people properly, musicians or filmmakers or whatever, please do that.
Do you think we'll slip back into physical media? Maybe going back that way?
I don't think we've ever left it. There was this thing about how ebooks might remove, displace books, and no, that they've supplemented them. So I think certainly some forms of physical media are here to stay just because they're better and they're a better delivery system for what we want.
Mm-hmm. It's nice to actually act on impulse and just to I want to read that now and download something straight to your Kindle.
Well, I don't rule out like in the future. I was just thinking the other day, I wouldn't want to go on holiday with a Kindle. I understand the attraction because you have a million books, but I want a book in my hand to read because it's a better way of experiencing the story. It's reading a book. But I suddenly thought, what if you could have like a book? It's like a book, but it changes into any other book, right? And that's not unimaginable if you had some kind of smart paper, right? Well, I'd be down with that because I've got the real book in my hand, and then just when I finished it, it magically turns into another book. That's perfectly fine with me when we reach that level of e-bookness. But I think that's a little way off yet.
I've reached that age though where I do fall asleep reading a book. So the big thing for the Kindle for me is that it automatically opens up at the page I'd got to.
There are a lot of, and many's the time I'm reading a book that's made of paper and thinking, I wish I could search for that word or for that name in the text, right?
Yeah.
I'd love to be able to do that. But the advantages of the Kindle are outweighed for me by the disadvantage. I mean, things like I love knowing how many pages I've got left to read. I'm sure there's ways on Kindle of checking your progress, but it's not as
It gives you a
intuitive.
percentage, which is
Yeah,
that little.
maybe that's just as good. I've not been an habitual reader of the Kindle.
No. That's completely fine. Like you say, like with the physical media and what have you, it can all exist. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, does it?
Not
So,
at all.
talking of which, Marvel or DC?
I'm going to say DC, but both because I grew up with DC, and we had these divisions when we were kids. We were Marvel or DC, and Marvel was always they had Steranko and Nick Fury and Jack Kirby and Doctor Strange, and they were cooler. But DC at its best kind of. But to tell you the truth, that answer is largely motivated by the dominance of our cinema by Marvel, and I'm just kind of riled by that. And having said that, every time I see a Marvel movie, I think, oh, that's a great movie. But I think that they have swamped it's not healthy for everything to be Marvel stuff. So I think my answer was motivated by that. But also, if you look at DC, Batman, I think he's better than any Marvel superhero. Like I love Marvel superheroes. I think Spider-Man's great and all the rest of it. But Batman is just great. And like Superman is the archetypical. Between them, you've just mopped up all the superheroes. You've got a load of superheroes at Marvel, but none of them are of the stature of Batman and Superman. And I don't like Superman. Batman I do like because he's kind of spooky and scary. So that's great. But if I was to choose my DC superheroes, it wouldn't be either of those guys. It would be Green Arrow, wow. Drawn by Gil Kane, for any
Gil
trained
Kane,
spotters
incredible
there.
artist. Yeah, yeah.
And the aliens, like you'd meet all the alien lanterns, and there'd be these brilliantly drawn aliens conceived by Gil Kane. Marvelous artwork. Yeah. So, and the stories weren't that great, although they did have some interesting writers like Gardner Fox working on them. But it's certainly for a kid growing up, if you like science fiction, that was a very science fictional kind of superhero. The movie they made had a lot of talented people involved, but boy, was it a mess.
Mm-hmm. There's a kind of feeling, for me, it feels like with DC that they're trying to apply that darkness of Batman to everything. And one of the things I loved as a kid with the DC comics was they were so bright and so fantastical that, Marvel, yes, they had that strength because they were rooted in a kind of a realism.
Well, they had
But
angsty teen soap opera stuff in
yeah,
Marvel, which they didn't do in DC, at least not originally. But DC had all kinds of wild and wacky. And I was thinking about this the other day. They had, like, the Spectre. They had the Geek. Does anybody remember the Geek? Jonah Hex, which was a Western comic.
mm,
They had the Hawk and the Dove. That was a Steve Ditko creation. These two superheroes, and one was like, well, one was the Hawk and one was the Dove, and they were brothers, and that was kind of wild too. And
yeah.
yeah,
Plastic Man.
these well, you Plastic Man, Jack Cole, dating back to, I think he might even have originally been part of the Will Eisner group of superheroes. Plastic Man, fantastic character, really great. But
Mm,
as soon as we start talking about the Spirit, we've moved away from DC into another great of vintage comics.
absolutely.
So it's
I
not a
could.
dichotomy. There were other comics. There was the Will Eisner studio. I can't even remember what imprint they were published under, but it wasn't just straight up DC or Marvel. The Eisner stuff was, I remember now, was published in something called the Spirit section, which was a comic, like a comic book, but it came in the Sunday newspaper with the Sunday funnies. So it was a more interesting landscape than the current dualism that we live under.
Mm. Okay, let's move away from comics, even though I could talk about them all night. What are we looking at? Okay, let's ask something that a lot of our viewers, stroke listeners, will be wanting to hear. For some reason, JL's picked out these two particular stories: Delta and the Bannerman, or the Happiness Patrol.
Happiness Patrol. I love Malcolm Cole, and I was on location for Delta. It was glorious. I've got a lot of good memories. But Happiness Patrol is actually about something, and it's about something profound and simple, and it's got this tremendous twisted metaphor, which, it's a crime to be unhappy, and it's a rich and rewarding metaphor that never ceases to deliver the goods. Do you remember? You may not, but a number of years ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury name checked it in his Easter sermon. He talked about, there was a Doctor Who story about a planet where it was a crime to be unhappy. Oh, that was the Happiness Patrol going for it. And also wrapped up in all that, besides it being brilliant, my friend Graham Curry, who wrote it, is no longer with us, and I love him and I miss him. And he created something amazing. So the Happiness Patrol, absolutely.
It's only one of those stories which is getting another wave of appreciation all the time. This is the thing. Every era of Doctor Who has its fans and its not so fans. But as time moves on, we've got that lovely
It's
effect of being able to,
reappraised. Yeah.
yes, having a bit of perspective, a bit of distance, and being able to. You mentioned Sophie earlier. I was going to ask you, have you heard the news of what's coming up in the next episode?
Yeah, that was great. It was such a fantastic coincidence. Like, because I invited Sophie to my play, and I discovered, oh wow, she's back in the show. And I rubbed my hands with selfish glee, thinking, oh, that could be useful from a publicity point of view. She's got another 50,000 followers, as well she should.
I mean, for me, it's a lovely thing because I do feel like, and again, this is through rewatching and from talking on the podcast about it and reassessing things and realizing what these things. Your era of Doctor Who very much feels like the bridge between what I suppose people will call the classic series and the new series.
Thank you,
So
and especially I would single out the story "Survival" by Rona Munro, which is the ultimate transitional story, which points the way to towards Rose and the sort of stuff that Russell would do.
yeah, totally. So to have Sophie there being the crossover as well and stepping in
Oh,
there.
it's great, and Sophie's so good in that. It's it's such an interesting story.
I'll be fascinated to see where they place Ace in her life, whether they touch on the new adventures or anything like that, or whether it's
Well,
going to.
they should if they're involving Ace, they should really involve Ian Briggs, who more than anybody else created the initial concept of Ace. He did not create the concept of Ace, but what he did was he brought it to life through the brilliance of his writing, and he invested her with a reality that she didn't have on paper. So it's why isn't Ian Briggs working on it? It drove me nuts when they wouldn't hire Mark Platt. They were going to do an adaptation of his audio story, his Cyberman audio story, Spare Parts. And instead of doing the right thing and hiring him and loving him and nurturing him, because he's this genius writer, they just sort of they treated him very shabbily, I think, and did something less interesting.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Where with your new theatre production, I see that you're not directing as well. That's not been tempting for you to do that.
No, I did direct one of my plays at university, and I'm a very good writer, and I'm an okay sort of director. Plus, it's really hard work. I'd much rather get another mind in, somebody who's really into directing as much as I'm into writing, and then we're going to have a much more interesting product.
And do you take a step back from that? You don't get involved?
Yeah, you got to be involved, because we're starting rehearsals next week, and I'm not going to be there every day, but I'm going to be there quite a lot. And I had the director on the phone today saying, why don't we do this? And he had a great idea. So yeah, we'll be doing that.
So fully collaborative then.
Well, it's fully collaborative, except I reserve the right to say no. I guess that's what being fully collaborative involves too.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, what should we look at now? How are we doing for time for you?
What time did you want to wrap? After 45 minutes or an
Yeah, that
hour?
sounds about right. That should be
Yeah,
okay.
right.
Okay. Okay. Judge Dredd or The Prisoner?
The Prisoner. Not, but I do like Judge Dredd, but Judge Dredd is a comic and Prisoner is a TV series. Plus, The Prisoner is more brilliant. Sure, The Prisoner was a comic, and there's a couple of Judge Dredd movies. One of them quite good, but the concept of The Prisoner is more interesting and it's better executed, I would have said. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Theatre or cinema?
Theatre, in the terms of me writing it, because I can write something and it can be very true to my original intentions. Whereas if you're lucky enough to write a film, you're just at the beginning of a process. You're like the guy who sort of sets the circus in motion and then stands back and watches it. And although a writer can be very well served by a film, often they become a minor functionary, sort of for reasons you can understand. But in terms of enjoying it, I was such a movie nut. I used to go like 4 or 5 times a week. The pandemic knocked that all out. I'm hoping to start going again, but I haven't yet. It's sort of changed my habits. But so what I'm doing now is I'm watching lots of movies at home, and I love movies. But in terms, I've got to say the theater is a deeper love, because it's something that I can sit down and write a play, and then within months it can be on. That's not the case with movies.
Do you find yourself writing theatre, but finding things in there that say, "Oh, actually, that would make a great scene in a movie," and do you find the two cross pollinating?
No, I've never felt that. I'd sort of be unlikely to feel that, because they're all about some powerful concept, right? Like the high concept. If you're writing a movie, you need a really strong kind of movie type story. So I'm not sure I could find myself just writing, something in a play. I think, oh, that would be useful in a movie. It would be more like a story point rather than a scene with some dialogue that I might think, oh, that's a movie. Because you might occasionally stumble on thinking, wow, that would be a cool kind of action movie.
Mm-hmm. And as far as casting's concerned, I see that you're using, because could you talk a little bit about your the Thursday theatre?
Okay, so what happened was everybody, or almost everybody, has a story like this. Just before the pandemic, we were about to put on a play. One of my plays was going to open in a very good Fringe theatre in the West End of London. Of course, that didn't happen. But in the in the course of the lockdowns, we started doing online play readings, and we developed a really good, strong repertory company of actors because it turned out there's a lot of actors who were cooling their heels in lockdown and they wanted to use their acting skills, and they actually enjoyed coming on Zoom and reading my plays. I'd write a new play, and then within days I would hear it read by these actors. It is on Zoom, and there are problems with Zoom, not least in terms of timing. Like musicians will tell you they can't play together because the timing's slightly off on Zoom, and that's true of actors too, who they have, their scenes are not just about saying the words, they're about interacting with each other in a very profound way. But you can get a pretty good idea of a play, and you can still get a pretty good performance out of somebody on Zoom. And now it's wonderful to be working with many of these same people in the real world.
That's I think that's lovely, the way you can plant these seeds and start working like that. As you say, that the amount of projects that have come out of this lockdown, out of a really negative experience, to bring something positive out of the end is amazing. So it's wonderful. Did you want to talk about the cast at all? Because it's literally three. It's a trio of actors.
It's what we call a three-hander. And so you could have a play that's a monologue with just one person, or you can have a two-hander. But a three-hander is in many ways the perfect balance between enough people and not, because the larger the cast, the more difficult it is to put the play on, simply for logistical and financial reasons. But so you narrow it down, then you get to three people, and that's like going any less than three people can become problematical. So it's the perfect, for a low budget play, it's the perfect number. And what we've got Colin Hill, who he's a bit modest about this, but he's acted for Scorsese. He was in the Gangs of New York for Martin Scorsese. So he's an actor of considerable stature. He plays the father in the play. And his daughter is played by Sadie Pepperell, who's this marvelous actress that I remember when she came and sat down in the audience beside me at one of my play readings. My friend, the director, Conrad Blakemore, had got to know her. And we've known each other for years, but this is our first chance to work together. And I'm terribly impressed with her. And Jamie Hutchins, he's the third side of this triangle. He's sort of the young intruder who walks into the life of this father and daughter. And Jamie was going to be in the play that got cancelled. So it's been a long, hard trip. But the great thing about Jamie and the others is that they like my writing, and they actually take an interest in it, and they value a play by Andrew Cartmel, which is so rewarding to me. It means so much to me. Obviously, everybody wants to have their play be a huge hit and be really rich and famous, but having a few people you respect also respect you is a wonderful kind of is not that far from all those other things that people really deeply want. That this is an important and very rewarding thing just in itself.
Yeah. Listen, we've pretty nicely, I think we've completed the sandwich, haven't we, with the play at either end?
Yeah, so, well, just to remind people, the play's on in a couple of weeks' time, from May the 3rd to May the 8th at the OSO, which stands for Old Sorting Office, which is an arts centre and a very good cafe and bar, if I say it myself, in Barnes in southwest London. So the play, crucially, is called Glacier Lake. Some people call it Glacier Lake. That's okay with me.
Excellent. That's great. Wonderful. Just one very quick question, but
sure.
before we finish, this isn't on JL's list of questions, but it's on one of mine. When you have your cream tea, do you put the jam on the top or on the bottom under the cream?
I don't have cream teas, isn't that terrible? But if I was to have it, I would put the cream on both. So I'd have like a cream sandwich. You definitely got to have the cream on the scone or whatever, because it's like butter. Then you put the jam on, but having the cream on top of that too is very appealing. So I'd say both.
There we go. That's a very diplomatic answer. Thank you very much, Andrew. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining in our experiment, and hopefully we'll get to speak to you again soon.
It's been a thrill. When you say that they're also watching on YouTube, are they watching the video, or is it just like an audio against a fixed picture?
They'll be watching the video.
Oh, so I should have kept the light on. Never mind. Sorry about that, folks.
That's fine. You looked very dark and mysterious like Batman just for a moment.
I looked quite satanic, so that wasn't a bad thing. So that Superb, but yeah, it's shining in my eyes. Oh, I can turn that goddamn light off now, but a little too soon. Forgive me, or anybody who's watching as well as listening.
I apologize if it's come across like an interrogation, but it's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
My favorite interrogation yet. Thank you.
Take care.
Cheers.